Residential tenants in Ontario have already started to receive notice that their rents are going up. The freeze prompted by COVID-19 is set to expire on January 1st, 2022. We'll hear from both sides of the equation. First up, the tenant perspective. And with us for that, both in the provincial capital, in Weston, Marcia Stone, co-chair of Weston Acorn, a chapter of the national advocacy organization Acorn Canada. And in Etobicoke, Douglas Kwan, Director of Advocacy and Legal Services for the Advocacy Centre for Tenants, Ontario. Good to have you two with us on our program tonight. Let's just do a little background in place for those people who maybe haven't followed this issue all that carefully. Douglas, why was the rent freeze implemented in the first place?
It was a response to the pandemic and the economy that Ontario experienced the worst recession since over the last 50 years as a result of the pandemic. A lot of tenant advocates and landlord advocates were calling on real rental support to support them during the pandemic. And what happened instead was a rent freeze that was in place in 2021, where rents would stay frozen for the entire year.
And did it cover all tenants in the province of Ontario?
It covered most tenants, but there's also a large segment of tenants or tenant situations that are not covered. Vacancy decontrol, where empty units are not subject to rent control, were not impacted by the rent freeze, as well as units that were shared with the landlord, where the washroom or kitchen is shared with the landlord. Those units were not exempted from the rent control provisions.
Okay, so Marcia, bring us up to today now. With the freeze about to expire, what do you think the impact is going to have on the folks that you represent?
Unfortunately, since COVID's not over, what I believe that tenants can expect is that they are going to get rent increases that they may not be able to afford. Tenants in buildings before or that are built after November 2018 could have their rent increase by any amount because they're not protected. This is why Acorn is out here pushing for an extension of the rent increase, not to mention real rent control and a ban on above guideline increases during this pandemic. People won't have anywhere to go if they're evicted from their places. They can't afford to live in these apartments. So where are they going to go? What is going to be the result? You're going to have people living in the street. You may have more encampments going up. There's people struggling with mental health issues, people trying to feed their children and their families. They're still out of work. So COVID's not over, and the government does not seem to be looking to help the tenants. It's a stressful time for everybody, and especially the low to moderate income people.
So you want to see the freeze extended. For how long, for example?
I would say that they should extend the freeze to at least a year, after COVID kind of decreases, I guess, and they can see that there is no uptake, but they should leave it at least a year until COVID is over, so people can still recover. They're not recovered in any way, shape, or form, unfortunately.
Now, Marcia, I know there are going to be people watching this, and the long list of disastrous things that potentially could happen that you just gave, and they're going to be saying to themselves, boy, she's painting the most awful picture she possibly can paint in order to advocate for the people she represents. So let me ask you, did you over-dramatize that list of potential negative consequences?
No, I didn't, because before pandemic, all this stuff was going on anyway. People were struggling to pay their high cost of rent, putting food on their table, medical aid, internet, daycare, you name it. It's a trickle down, a domino effect, if you want. And if you look around your communities, pay attention to the news, and you see what people are going through. There's no dramatization of anything. It's a reality for a good percentage of the people that live in this city.
Okay, Douglas, let me get you to follow up with this. We know the freeze was, theoretically in place during COVID-19. Could landlords increase the rent anyway, even with the freeze in place? Was there a way to do it?
Certainly. They could do so by applying for above guideline rent increases. So if they had invested in their property, they could have passed those costs down to tenants even during the freeze. As I mentioned, vacancy decontrol was still in place. So what we were seeing was long-term tenants being evicted during the course of the rent freeze, and prior to that, through no fault evictions, such as rent evictions, or where the landlord were asking that the unit be vacant for their own personal use. Landlords were finding many different ways to get around the rent freeze during this time, so they could maximize a hot real estate market.
Now, you just used an expression there that I'm not sure everybody understands. Rent evictions. What's a rent eviction?
A rent eviction is where a landlord informs the tenant that they need the unit to be vacant in order to, demolish or convert or renovate a unit. They would inform the tenant that they have a right to return to unit and paying at the same rent, but a lot of times these renovations take 3 months, 6 months to a year before it's completed. And by that time, most tenants have found a new home, and they don't know are not familiar with the rights to return. And so what happens is that the landlord gets a vacant unit, it's in better shape, and they can charge a higher rent as a result.
Okay, but I thought the province of Ontario put a stay on evictions in place over the past year. Was that not the case?
There was a stay on evictions between March to I believe to May, and then there was another moratorium in the beginning of 2021. But that was really only for the enforcement of eviction orders. The process of the Landlord and Tenant Board, which is an independent body that hears disputes between landlords and tenants, was still operating from September 2020 up until now. So they were issuing eviction orders almost through the entire period of the pandemic.
Understood. Okay, Marcia, I know it's not your job here tonight to represent the views of landlords. I understand that. But landlords are half the equation here, and so I do need to ask you about them. You know, there are mom and pop landlords who are having to make payments to the bank in order to make sure that they can continue to own their properties. And as I say, I know it's not your problem to look out for them, but if the freeze continues, some of them may not be able to make those payments and they may lose their properties. Is that a problem that you have to be aware of?
Yes, we're aware of those situations. But again, there's a lot of loopholes out there that landlords are using. The government allows them to use those loopholes, and they're using those against their tenant. It's the bottom line is that it's with the contractors and the builders, everybody seems to be on board saying that they're making affordable housing. However, they're not putting people over profits, and that's the problem. People over profits, rich over poor. This is what we deal with on a daily basis. And I'm sure that if you heard some of the individual stories that we get from people that call and attend our chapter meetings, you'd be in shock, because landlords get away. They have the upper hand. They have all the control. If they don't want you in their place, like he said, you can use rent evictions, or they won't do the repairs in the building, so that you will either move out or they'll try to pay you off minimum money to relocate. But the question is, where are people relocating to? There's no affordable housing here in Ontario. So that's why I said there's going to be encampments. If the landlords would work, and the landlord associations and the city would sit down and work with the people, then maybe we would have some kind of progress. But as it stands now, it's people over profits.
No, I appreciate your position.
People.
I understand. I appreciate your position on this. But Douglas, you know, let me ask you this. At some point, the freeze has to come off, right? The freeze can't last forever. And let's just look at a couple of facts. 85% of the people in the province of Ontario are vaccinated now. All of the jobs that were lost during the course of the pandemic, we are told, have come back. So if now is not the time to take the freeze off, when's a better time?
Well, we're supportive of the freeze, absolutely, but we've always advocated for actual rent relief as well. These are direct rent relief supports for tenants to help them get out of the hole that they find themselves in because of the rent arrears that have accumulated ever since March of 2020. We're asking that the government close the loopholes for vacancy control because we believe that that will support tenants and ensure that affordable housing is available to them. It's a very challenging time, and certainly if you're looking for a specific timeline, I can't give that to you. But just keep in mind that although the economy is returning, we're still in our fourth wave. Those who have had rent arrears accumulate, even if they found the same job paying at the same rate that they once did, they'll have to find a higher paying job to cover those rent arrears that have accumulated in the past. So renters find themselves in a very challenging situation, especially when you look at the minimum wage rising by only 10 cents and the rent increase next year rising by 1.2%. And the costs of inflation is going up as well. 35% of tenants earn less than $30,000 a year, and that was in 2016. The situation hasn't improved for them. Mm-hmm. So really, they were already in a challenging time prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has only made things worse.
Well, let me get Marcia to comment on that, because obviously we're not too worried here about people who are paying $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 a month in rent. They're doing fine, they can afford it. But the low-income tenants, the people who are in real trouble, Marcia, besides a 6-month extension on the rent freeze, what do you think the province of Ontario could be doing to help those folks?
It's a, like he said, it's very challenging, and trying to come up with ideas constantly, because remember, CRB is going to be running out for people as well this month, in the next week or so. So now you've got it even more, compounded, a compounded issue. Work with the people and come up with a plan that's beneficial to the people. Talk to the people that are being affected by this homelessness and the stress of trying to maneuver throughout this pandemic. Rents anywhere from $2,000 up. It's ridiculous. People on fixed incomes are struggling. I, as a pensioner, have to struggle. And it doesn't seem like the government wants to sit down and talk to the people. They want to make decisions for the people without any kind of consultant. And if you're not above a certain income bracket, they don't want to hear from you. And, this is why we say your postal code should not determine the quality of service that you get. And I see it more and more every single day, and it really, really upsets me. I think the government, which are the elected officials that we put in place, need to start talking to the people and working with the people. Because remember, there'll be an election coming soon, and they'll be knocking on your door wanting your vote.
That's June 2nd, 2022. Yes, you are right.
Exactly.
It's on the calendar, and it's out there.
And the other thing is they keep doing studies. I mean, we bring kind of ideas and solutions to city council and the premier and whatever. However, if you're not trying to help the people, you keep prolonging these studies. Okay, we're going to do this in 2000. People need help now. This is 2021, 22. We need help now, not in the next year, not in 2 years from now. You still need a place to live. And if the government doesn't want to help the people, what are people going to do? You're going to have people out there, in dire straits.
That's Marcia Stone from Weston Acorn and Douglas Kwan from the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario. I thank both of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Steve.
And with us now for the Landlord Perspective in Orangeville, Ontario, Buba Ba. He is chair of SOLO, the Small Ownership Landlords Ontario. And in the provincial capital, Tony Irwin, President and CEO of the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario. And it's good to have you two with us tonight here on TVO. Tony, start us off here. How has the last year or so been for your members, given that a freeze has been in place?
Well, Steve, I think the last year has been obviously very difficult for everyone, for residents and for those who provide housing. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we, I think, have all done our part to try to work together to get through what has been obviously something that none of us have any experience with, has been extremely challenging and difficult. But we have, listened to calls from all political leaders to do our part and to help those who have been truly disadvantaged and had hardship during the pandemic. That said, there are rental housing providers who have had challenges also. And so we hear from members who say, we understand that there are many Ontarians who are struggling. We are struggling too. And so we also are doing our best as rental housing providers to get through. So it's been uneven for everyone. Admittedly, there are bright spots. The vast majority of rent has been paid during the pandemic, which we think is great, but it doesn't mean there haven't been challenges for many. And our members certainly have done their part to try to help get them through that. And that's really what the last year has looked like. And we're all just hoping for better days. We think we're starting to see it, but it has been difficult for many to get through this last year. There's no doubt about that.
Well, we just heard about some of the challenges that tenants have had, and now I want to find out some of the challenges that landlords have had. And Buba, I'll ask you about that. How were the people that you represent, how were the landlords able to, for example, pay for things like repairs or renovations when there was a rent freeze in place?
Okay, thank you. For small landlord, you're talking about people who have like a few property, like renting your basement, having a duplex. Unlike the big landlord, most of their income comes from rental. The fact there has been a rent freeze made their position very, very difficult. I'm explaining why. There have been a rent freeze for 2021 and everything went up. You're talking about gas that went up, maintenance went up, labor went up. Still, the rent became the same. So what happened to the small landlord is they are losing basically 50 to 100% of their income if there is no rent payment. The rent freeze has been very bad, but some of the landlord managed to use their line of credit, go into the further debt in order to to maintain the property, because by law they are obligated to maintain the property.
So just to confirm then, do you know of any landlords that you represented who said, I just can't do this anymore because of the rent freeze, I'm going to have to give up my property?
We got at least anecdotally, we have at least a dozen of landlords who get out of the rental business. It's just simple math. If you can't, if your income doesn't cover your cost, you can go for a while, but after a while, you would just have to make a decision. Yeah, small landlords are getting out of the rental business, yes.
Okay, Tony, having said that though, yes, the freeze was in place, but there were ways to apply for special exemptions in order to raise the rent for a variety of reasons. Landlords did take advantage of that, yes?
There are some certainly who did, Steve, but there are also many who did not. So you are right, above guideline increases were still available in certain circumstances, and some rental housing providers did go forward with that work that needed to be done and did go to the Landlord Tenant Board to apply for that increase. But there are many others who simply have not. They have really sort of hunkered down and focused on what's most important during the pandemic, the enhanced cleaning protocols, keeping their residents and staff safe, and they've elected not to proceed with some of those repairs and upgrades right now, simply because it wasn't, just didn't make sense. There were more pressing priorities that needed to be looked after than some of those.
And I'll ask you the same question I just asked Buba, which is, do you know of any people who just said, you know what, to hell with this. This is too tough a way to make a living and I'm getting out?
You know what, I don't know that I've heard of any who have absolutely gotten out simply expressly because of the pandemic. I've heard many stories of rental housing providers who have said over the last year, maybe this was the tipping point. Maybe this is what said, you know what, this is the end. But there were maybe other factors that contributed to it leading up to the pandemic, difficulties in collecting rent and just trouble being able to provide housing. There's no doubt that this certainly put some of them over the top and said, I'm out. I simply can't do this anymore. Okay.
Buba, have the landlords that you represent received any government assistance to help them over the past year?
No.
Nothing at all?
Nothing at all. There was no specific program designed for small landlord. If you're a corporate landlord, you can apply for some business support. As an individual landlord, somebody's renting the basement, the triplex, or the duplex, there have been not a single program designed specifically for those people.
Did you think there should have been?
Actually, we did ask the provincial government to put us in the same level playing field than anybody else, and so far we haven't received any response. If you are unemployed, you receive CERB. If you are a business, let's say you are a big corporate landlord, you have employees, you get some type of subsidy. If you're a commercial landlord, you got a program specifically designed for them. It's called, I forget what's the name. And the artist, the farmer, everybody basically got a specific program that was tailored to their need. The small landlord were the only group that has been forced to bear the cost of housing people for free during the pandemic. And that's not right.
Okay, Tony, let me follow up with this.
Sure.
You know, we appreciate the fact that the past year has been difficult on everybody, including landlords. I think Buba gave us a list a moment ago of the fact that air conditioning costs or heating costs, whatever, would have gone up, insurance rates would have gone up. I mean, there's a whole bunch of expenses that you guys would have had to deal with. There was a property tax holiday for a little while for municipalities, which no doubt helped the bottom line a little bit. On balance, how did landlords, in your view, get through the past year?
I think on balance, they got through by making some difficult choices, as we talked about, deferring some projects that certainly that could not be advanced, couldn't be moved forward on at this time. You know, I think it was really trying to get through, help the residents who were not able to pay rent with those who were paying. But really, Steve, at the end of the day, there are, you know, some of them have been able to get through more easily than others. It's not been an even journey for all. And as Buba talked about, certainly for many smaller landlords, the journey's been very difficult. Those who are larger, who have scale, perhaps have been able to get through a little bit more easily, but they've had to make choices. If our family budget's impacted, something happens to your spouse or to you in your employment, you have to make some choices, and they're not always easy choices to make. But what didn't get compromised was safety, the building integrity, things that needed to happen to keep buildings safe and keep them running. Those did not get compromised on. Other things that maybe could wait are waiting and have waited to such time that they can, you know, the conditions recover more and those improvements are able to get made. But it's like any business, any family. When you face adversity, you have to make difficult choices sometimes, and that's certainly what many landlords have had to do to be able to get through this.
Now, Buba, one of the reasons that this is such a complicated issue that's always fraught with challenges is that, I mean, you guys are not really selling a normal product. You're selling somebody's home. Now, they don't own it, but still, it's home for them. And I wonder how much sympathy you have for example, low-income tenants who, you know, don't want to be evicted, obviously, in the middle of a global pandemic, and who have challenges of their own trying to pay the bills and take care of everything. I know you've got difficulties, but how much sympathy did you have for the tenants?
Big sympathy. Nobody, no small landlord wants to evict a tenant, because evicting a tenant basically meaning a loss of income, and to find a new tenant, it's going to go through a process during which you don't collect any rent. And let's make it clear, the majority of the tenants are law-abiding citizens who basically pay the rent or make an effort to pay the rent. Our problem is the system, the way it's designed right now. Unscrupulous tenants who play the system and are able, I just have to insist that, they are able, but they refuse to pay, and there is no consequences for them.
How much of that went on, Buba?
We did a survey within our organization. I can tell you maybe 1 to 3% of our membership, which is a very small windows of landlords in Ontario, have faced what we call difficult tenant who collect CERB, who collect from the rent bank and refuse. I'm not, they basically, it's not like they are struggling. They refuse to pay even a partial payment.
I guess I'm wondering, I mean, is that a widespread phenomenon, or that would just be a handful of people?
This is like a car accident. You got, people riding their car, no accident happened. But once it happened to one person, that becomes a huge issue for the whole community. Personally, as a small landlord, I never have any issue with my tenants. So now hearing the other people, their issue for what we call professional tenants, I realize it can happen to anybody. So what we are asking is the system to be fair. So people who are able to pay the rent and refuse to pay the rent, and the system allows them to, to not to pay the rent, that should be addressed. Otherwise, what's going to happen? People are going to be very reluctant to rent because, hey, I don't want to end up with somebody who refuses to pay the rent and there's nothing I can do about it. And yes, we do have a sympathy. Like if somebody can't pay, you sit down together, you talk to your tenant. Hey, I can't pay. I will pay maybe 50% today, or I can't pay. Can we break the lease? That happens all the time. But we're talking about a small minority of people who refuse and been encouraged by groups that are all over the social media. And it started with the premier, who basically told them in March 2020, if you can't pay your rent, do not pay your rent.
Right. Okay. You mentioned the system there, and I want to ask Tony in our last couple of minutes about that, because there is this thing called the Landlord and Tenant Board, which has obviously oversight responsibilities in this area. What kind of changes would you like to see to the way it works that you think would make things work better?
Well, Steve, I mean, as Buba was talking about when he was speaking, certainly our view was, in our conversations with government, were about keeping the board open. We know there were obviously periods of time where there was a moratorium on evictions. We understood that, but our message always to government was, we need to get the board open. It is as you said, Steve, it is the place for landlords and tenants to go to have disputes adjudicated. It's important for access to justice, and it needs to be available and open. And it is, and it has been now for some time, and we think that's good for both sides. In terms of the system itself, the government's done a great job at hiring more adjudicators. That was a huge need for more. Get them trained up and get them actually working. That's been is certainly greatly improved over just a few years ago. There still are big time delays. It still takes a very long time to get from the time a hearing is scheduled to actually getting in front of an adjudicator to then getting a ruling and getting that ruling issued. There still are huge time delays. It's gotten a lot better. But it could be better. It could be better still. It's not beneficial to either side to have to wait for an inordinate period of time to have a hearing and then have a judgment issued by an adjudicator. So the one thing I would say is just trying to make the system a little more efficient. And with anything like this where you're hiring new adjudicators, getting them trained up, getting them working, it does take time. There's a ramp up period, and so I think we'll just continue to see that improve. And as I said, I think that's beneficial for all parties.
And Tony, in our last 20 seconds here, of course, when the freeze comes off at the beginning of next year, landlords are not obliged to increase the rent, but do you suspect 100% of them will?
I would suspect that a great number will, Steve. I mean, it's been since 2019 for many, since many tenants have had a rent increase. The increase, I think, is pretty modest at 1.2%. I think the vast majority of tenants will be able to make that rent increase payment without difficulty. And for those who cannot, who are still being challenged by the pandemic and still have hardship, we will continue to work with those residents. We don't want to see people evicted either. I know that some may not believe me when I say that, but we simply do not. We want to work with those who have made efforts to pay, who have done their very best to contribute whatever rent amount they can during the pandemic. And if they're still having trouble because of the pandemic, we will be there to help and do all that we can. And that's, I think, how we will get through this all together.
Tony Irwin and Buba Ba, we thank you for joining us on TVO tonight and sharing your views. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be with you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.